We are jumping back into the book of Genesis. We've been here all week. We started with Noah. We ran through Abraham yesterday, which feels like we did him a disservice, but did what we had to do to get to Isaac today. So we met Isaac yesterday. We're going to dig into his life a little more today. But before we get started, will you pray for us, and then we'll move along.
Yeah, let's do this. God, I thank you so much for a chance to be together, to gather, to grow, to learn, and to just laugh a little bit together and learn about new coffee beverages. God, I appreciate so much that you are just the same God every day, whether it's a Wednesday, a Thursday, a Monday. You are still good and you are still God. And as we continue to read these stories, it is so clear that you are good and you are God and you are working through all of these people and through all of us today. God, we thank you and we just ask that you open our hearts and our minds together today. And we pray. Amen.
Amen. All right. So yesterday we started talking about Isaac. Isaac is the son of Abraham, and Abraham is the first fella that God is really creating this long-lasting covenant. So he made a covenant with Noah in regards to the way that God would relate to human beings, and that he would not harm them with a flood. Essentially, I am paraphrasing. But then we get to Abraham yesterday, and God makes a more significant covenant or a more significant promise with him. And what he's saying to Abraham here is, I'm actually going to bless not only you, but generations, your family line forever. And at that point, Abraham's like, but I don't even have any kids. I'm 75 years old and my wife is barren, and we're pretty much beyond the years where we can have kids. And God just continues to remind him of this promise that he's making. And at one point is even saying like, hey, kings will come from you. And then he even makes kind of this idea that this eternal king at some point will come from this line of Abraham. And so after 25 years of waiting and hearing God remind him of this promise, Abraham has a son with his wife, Sarah, and they name him Isaac. And so we ended yesterday with this very weird story that kind of got me a little choked up, but it's this story where God is testing Abraham, and he's asking him to sacrifice Isaac, the son that he loves. He's asking Abraham to sacrifice him. And Abraham doesn't question it, and he goes along with it, not because he doesn't love his son, but because he knows that obedience to God is great and will result in goodness. And so he ends up not having to go through with it. God provides a ram in the thicket. And we talked yesterday about how this is such a beautiful way of pointing our eyes from a story thousands and thousands of years ago and thousands of years before Jesus to what God would do with Jesus. So while he prevented Abraham from having to sacrifice his son, God does go through and sacrifices his beloved son for us. And so we see that in the person of Jesus. So it's neat where we can see these little foreshadows of who Jesus will be and what God will do in and through Jesus. So just wanted to kind of pull us into where we are. And then Kelsey, we're going to move forward. So anything you want to add to that, or anything from today that you want to get us set up for success with?
I think the one thing, Abraham, great dude, also kind of a hot mess at times, and that's okay. That is true of every character in the Bible until Jesus, and he just carries our hot mess. So that feels pretty appropriate for us. But as we read, we talked about it a little bit before we got on here, but there's this picture in the story of Isaac that it's not really Isaac that's center stage. This really gets to be a story where the people around Isaac have some value and some importance, and honestly, some people that wouldn't have value and importance in that society. So there's something really good happening. But Isaac really is nonchalant. Granted, if one of your first memories is your dad taking you up to the top of a mountain to sacrifice you, there may be some questions about your value in life. So there's an interesting thought there that leaves you kind of wondering how Isaac feels about his life and his journey. So, but there's some good highlights of some side characters, which is kind of fun.
Yeah. And it is interesting. I was telling Kelsey, one of the books that I like to reference is just this How to Read a Bible book by book. It just kind of breaks things down real simple. And I start the section on Isaac and it says, Isaac's story really is about Jacob, who is his son. So I'm thinking, like, I was already thinking, man, Isaac there's just not a lot there. And then the book just kind of confirmed there's just not a lot there. But like I said, we're going to actually pull out some of these minor characters who really play a big role in Isaac's life and help propel the story forward. So I'm excited about today. Greg has a concern here. If he adds collagen to his coffee, will he end up with overplump lips? I don't think lips can ever be too plump. So Greg, I would go for it and just see what happens. You can let us know how your experiment goes. And then good morning, Ron. He says, coffee freshly ground and black. That's a serious coffee drinker.
I'm with you. The problem is all I have is the hand crank one at home because it like makes your grounds the best. And I don't have that kind of time. So I'm with you. But
I can never get my beans ground right. And so they always end up not good. And then I'm just sad. So I just buy the ground coffee for someone who doesn't know the difference. Sherry, good morning. Okay, so Kelsey, let's get started. We're going to kind of go backwards because we skipped over Isaac's birth yesterday. We referenced it, but we skipped it. So we're going to start there. And then we're going to move. So starting in chapter 21, it says here, the Lord visited Sarah, so Abraham's wife, as he had said. There was this really cool story about some visitors that visit Abraham, and they confirm that he's going to have a son in a year. Sarah hears it, and she laughs because she's like, I am 99 years old, or whatever. And I'm 90 years old because she was 10 years younger than Abraham. Like, what in the world? And they hear her, and they're like, why did you laugh? And she lies. And so then we get about a year later, and Sarah becomes pregnant as the Lord had promised, and she has a son. And then it says here in verse 5, Abraham was 100 years old. So, we like to see God move, but I like to see God move in about 24 hours. That's about as long as I want to give him. And Abraham waited 25 years. So it just puts kind of the perspective of God's timeline. And you think even at 75 years old, that would have been a crazy thing. At 100 years old, it was just unheard of. So it was this just really cool story of God's faithfulness. So Isaac is now on the scene. And now we're going to jump ahead into chapter 24. So in chapter 24, Sarah has passed away, and Abraham is well advanced in years. And it says, the Lord blessed Abraham in all things, and Abraham calls a servant of his, and it doesn't identify him with a name. And Kelsey and I are still looking because we feel like there is a name. But here it doesn't identify him with a name, but it says the oldest of his household. So I have to believe that this servant had been with Abraham for a long time, very loyal, and says, who had charge of all that he had. And he said, put your hand under my thigh that I may make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell. So going back to the beginning of Abraham's story, the very first thing that God asks Abraham to do is to go. And we talked about, even though these were semi-nomadic people, they weren't picking up and moving away from their families. They were moving as families from place to place to make sure that they had what they needed, the provisions that they needed. But God is kind of breaking that cycle, and he is saying, hey, I know this is what is known to you, but I want you to go to a different place, and I'm going to show you where that is. And out of just complete obedience, Abraham does it. And so now he's in a land that is not filled with his people, his tribe. And so this is concerning to him. He wants to make sure that his son marries someone from his tribe. And so he has a trusted servant. And then Kelsey, there's an interesting thing here, and I kept it in here because I wanted to make sure that we remembered that this is not the time that we live in. It's a very different time. And so the way that people swore and made oaths with one another was to put their hand underneath the other person's thigh. That feels awkward today, but it was very normal for that time. And so as we continue reading, when we read things that feel different, that feel like not the cultural norm, just kind of bring your brain back and remember, this is not the culture that we live in. It is not the time that we live in, and things were done differently. So I kept that in there because I feel like that's important to note. Anything else that you want to add to all of that?
One, it probably wasn't actually his thigh. I don't think we want to go too far into that. It was probably more inward than his thigh, but it was a normal way of saying, this is how serious this is, that you are taking this on with me, that this is something we're doing together. And it happens a couple times actually in the Bible, and always with someone who's older and about to die, making a promise in reference to his family, which is also interesting. So like, that's how important this was, is that this is close to our hearts. That's a big deal.
Yeah. So
yeah, I also wanted to mention, just because I'm the person that likes to know these things, so some of you might be too. The name Isaac means he is of laughter, or he laughs, which is ironic because that's what happened when his mom found out she was going to have a baby in old age. So, just as a side note.
And the funny thing is, we don't see him laughing very much. So
no,
I feel like he didn't carry his name.
Nope.
Dustin adding here, Isaac, is the only patriarch who doesn't get a section to himself. When you see these are the generations of so-and-so and so-and-so, it shows the start of a new story, specifically about the sons of so-and-so. There's no generations of Abraham, so there's really not a story about Isaac. Interesting. And then Greg says, kudos to Abraham. I'm worn out after 4 hours with the grandkids, and no, I'm not 100. Yes. Okay, so then this promise continues, this oath that they're making, Abraham to the servant, go to my country and to my kindred, to my people, to my family, and take a wife for my son Isaac. And so it was very, very important to Abraham that Isaac not marry from the Canaanite people that they were living among, but that he had a wife that came from his people, his tribe of people. So even before God had kind of created this chosen people of Israel that we'll get into actually tomorrow, you can see that Abraham is already identifying that he wants Isaac to have to marry someone from the people that he came from. So anyway, that is all of that. And then we get down to verse 6, and Abraham says to his servant, see to it that you do not take my son back there. Why do you think he adds that in there?
So good. If he promised to go and leave this land and to start a new nation and start a new people, he's not to go back. It's such a, like, it's a line you can just kind of pass through really easily, but there's this picture of when God calls us somewhere, how easy is it for us to just go back and just trust what we knew? And he's saying, don't, keep moving forward. God is not in the business of going back to what was, but he's in the business of creating new, which is just convicting, but also he's honoring the covenant that he made with God, that he would go and he would create a new people, and that there would be a future that isn't stuck in what was, but in what God is in the business of creating. It's it's something you could pass by and miss, but it's so good.
Yep. Yep. Sarah asked an interesting question. She said, wondering if Sarah's womb could have been closed before Isaac was born because of Abraham's earlier deal with Pharaoh. We talked about this a little bit yesterday. Abraham was kind of a chicken sometimes, and so he lied to Pharaoh when they were in Egypt and said that Sarah was his sister and got her to lie also, and that just didn't go well for anybody. But if you go all the way back to chapter 11, this is like right when we're just meeting Abraham. Sarah is barren when we meet her, just being identified as Abraham's wife. And at this time it was Abram's wife. So it says, where did I see that? I saw it somewhere. Anyway, Sarah is barren. Oh, here it is in verse 30. Now Sarai was barren. She had no child. So before Abraham's indiscretions and lies and poor choices, his wife was already barren. However, that is a theme that carries through in all of what we call the patriarchs. So Abraham and Sarai, barren. Sarah, barren. Isaac and Rebekah, we'll meet them. She is also barren. And then we get into Jacob and one of his wives, who is also barren. So it is a theme that will carry through, and it's an important theme. So good question there. So the servant, I love this servant. We were talking about him before we hopped on. He's so faithful. He goes on a journey, and it wasn't a short journey. It was a pretty significant traveling experience. And he goes and he finds Abraham's family. And as he is there, the servant probably didn't know the Lord in the same way that Abraham did. There's a possibility that he was not even of the same kind of people that Abraham was, and quite possible that he had his own gods that he prayed to. If you were with us this weekend, Phil talked about how most cultures believed in several gods. It was unique that the Israelite people believed in only one God. And here in chapter 24, verse 12, we see the servant say, "O Lord, God of my master Abraham." So not like my God, but God of Abraham, my master. And then he is asking him to be with him and to make it very clear to him who the woman is that should be Isaac's wife. Because what he has to do is a very unique thing. It's not like he's going to bring Isaac back to meet this woman and see if it's a good match. He's going to ask this woman who has never been anywhere except where she is, has never known anything except what she knows around her, to leave her family, to leave everything behind, and to come with a stranger to marry a stranger. Like, it's just it's a crazy thing. And so he says in his prayer to God, "Let the young woman to whom I shall say, 'Please let down your jar that I may drink,' and who shall say, 'Drink, and I will water your camels,' let her be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac." So he's very specific in what he's looking for and what he's asking for. And I love the faithfulness of this servant, even to a God that maybe wasn't his God. So I just think that's such a cool deal. And you were saying that you really enjoy the soul servant as well. What do you think?
Part of it is he's got some wisdom. This is called the camel test, which I understand is a weird thing because that's not how we find our spouses. We don't go to the local watering hole and see who offers us water and gives it to our camels. But like, he's just got so much faith in a God that he doesn't necessarily know, to take care of a master that he really, like, it's not a big deal. Like, he could have just been like, whatever, I just found a girl, it's fine, because it wasn't a big deal to him. And so he's being faithful to Abraham. But then on top of that, he wants to make sure he finds the right person for Isaac. And there's a couple of things happening with this camel test. Are we going to talk about it in a second? Potentially. So that he just like, he thought of a plan that was like, I want to find the exact right person. Like, just, there's something sweet about it. My brother just started dating this girl because two of his best friends were like, hey, we think this girl is good for you. And they did the work to like get to know her and like had her live in their house for a while. Like it was just sweet to be like, what great care for a friend to be able to say, I want to find the right person, not just a person.
Hmm.
It's just sweet.
That is neat. That is neat. And let's go back to Isaac for a minute. He's at home. And from all accounts, he's kind of in mourning because his mom had passed away. And he was kind of struggling with that. So he's at home. The servant, the trusted servant, is kind of doing the hard work here. And like Kelsey said, not just grabbing the first woman that he finds, but really making sure that he finds the right woman for Isaac to be his wife. So all of a sudden, we get into verse 15 here, and it says, before he had finished speaking, behold, Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, came out with her water jar on her shoulder. And then it says she was very attractive in appearance and a virgin that no man had known. So here she comes. She has no idea what she's walking into. She's just doing her daily chores. And she sees the servant running to her, and he asks for a drink of water. And then she says, drink, my lord. And then she says, I will draw water for your camels also until they have finished drinking. I mean, what do you think the servant was doing? I'm sure he was just like, what just happened here?
Mm-hmm. Well, and there's a couple things that, like, again, just easy to pass by. Like for him, he set this camel test up, like, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I'm asking for, which isn't testing God as much as saying, hey, God, I will recognize your work when you present it because I'll know these signs. Like there's a difference between, hey, God, if you're really up to this, if you're really going to do this, then I demand to see these things. And instead he's like, I'm going to trust this. And so then he gets to this girl and he doesn't have to do anything. He just asks for a drink, and she brings the jar down, which was actually the first sign that she was the right person, because she could have just poured from her shoulder, but then it would have put them face to face. So by putting the jar down, it's a sign of modesty to say, I don't need to be face to face with you. I trust you on your own. I'm not trying to get any connection beyond what I'm doing. So like he's already seeing her pass this test. And then she offers not only to dump out what's left of the water, but she goes and she gets water until the camels are completely finished drinking, which seems not terrible. There wasn't a hose. This was a big task. Like she was giving up hours, probably not hours, but quite a chunk of her time, quite a chunk of her energy. She was willing to stop in the middle of what she was supposed to be doing. Like all of these things point to her being just this kind, generous, overwhelmingly present human, honoring a servant, which she didn't need to do either. And so for both the servant and for her, like there's just this testament to God's faithfulness, but also to the goodness of these people. Just such a powerful story to them. That's pretty impressive.
Well, and if you've ever done any National Geographics about a camel, they drink a lot because they're filling their hump. And these camels, multiple, had just come a long way, and we don't know the last time that they had anything to drink. And so, like you said, I mean, this could have potentially been hours of her time making sure that she was drawing enough water for the camels to have their fill. So, I mean, it's a neat interaction between two very unlikely people that would have interacted together at this time. So, Dom says here, ding, 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 we have a winner. Like, it was very obvious to the servant that this was going to be the right one. And so he ends up going to her house with her, meets her brother and her mother. They don't really talk about her father. So I think the assumption is that he has passed away. But Laban is her brother. We'll meet him again. He's a super great fella. And I don't mean that for reals. And the servant basically lays out the story. Hey, this is who I am. This is who I represent. This is why I'm here. This is the prayer that I prayed. This is how your sister responded. I think she's supposed to come back with me. And Laban's like, I don't know. Maybe you guys could just hang out here for a little bit. And for whatever reason, there was just an urgency with the servant. And he was like, we really got to go. And Rebecca, in this moment of, I don't know what, she says, I'll go. No problem. I'm in. So she jumps on a camel and they take off and they go back to Canaan to meet Isaac. It's an amazing story for her. And we're going to see her painted in not quite as pretty of a picture tomorrow. We're going to see her start to be kind of deceptive, and we're going to see that carry on in that family quite a bit. But in this moment right here, we see a very beautiful picture of, again, this obedience that doesn't make any sense. And yet it is so much a part of what God's plan was. So we wanted to make sure we talked about that because it matters. And this is how Isaac's story continues, is because of Rebecca's obedience here. And then I've always thought this too, Dom. Maybe Rebecca left because she knew what a few more years with Laban would be like. Her brother was a stinker, for sure. So, yes. Okay. Any other thoughts on that? Because we cruised real quick through that.
No, that's good.
Okay. So then we get to the beginning of chapter 5 or chapter 25 here. And we see this phrase, after the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac and his son, or Isaac his son. And Isaac settled at that Hebrew word. And so what happens between where we left off and where we are is Isaac is out in the field. Rebecca sees him, so she covers herself, another form of modesty. And he comes to her, he accepts her immediately, and they marry, it feels like, Kelsey, within moments. I mean, it was very fast. And so it says at the end of chapter 24, the servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. Isaac brought Rebecca to the tent of Sarah, his mother, and took Rebecca as his wife. And he loved her, which is something that we don't see very often. And so I do have that double underlined here. And then Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. So here we are. We've moved forward. Abraham has passed away, and we see this phrase, God bless Isaac, his son. And so then we jump into chapter 26. Will you just give us a little framework around all of this?
Yes. At this point, Isaac has also had kiddos, Jacob and Esau, who will come into play tomorrow. So we're not going to dive super deep into that. And man, sibling rivalry at its best. So we're seeing some of that. We're seeing really not a whole lot from Isaac until we get to Abimelech. And Abimelech is this guy that actually we've seen already. Abraham made a commitment that, hey, our families are going to get along. We're not going to deceive each other. We're not going to lie to each other. We're just going to be civil with one another, which is kind of cool that these families just are like, let's be chill, which is not the case in a lot of nomadic societies. Living near each other can sometimes end a little poorly. But for him, there is more that is about to happen. Are we about to read that? I don't know.
Yeah, and I just wanted to highlight who Abimelech was. He was the king of the Philistines. And we've talked a little bit about where people descended from as far as from Noah. And the thought is that the Philistines, just like the Canaanites, also descended from Ham, the struggler of Noah's 3 sons. Shem is the son who the Hebrew nation descended from. So there's already a little bit of tension here, but Abimelech and Abraham had come to this pretty unique commitment to one another, like Kelsey was just talking about. And here now we see Isaac come on the scene. The idea was that this commitment to each other, this promise to each other, was going to carry generation after generation after generation. However, God has a conversation with Isaac here, and it says, sojourn in this land, and I will be with you, and I will bless you, your offspring. I will give these lands. I will establish this oath that I swore to your father. So God is reaffirming this covenant commitment that he has made with Abraham, and he's confirming that with Isaac. And then it says in verse 5, because Abraham obeyed my voice, kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, my laws. So we talked yesterday about how God is the one who's making the covenant promise. We are the one who, or his people are the ones who are supposed to keep it. And so it's a both and here. So now get into what happened, because one of the things that Kelsey and I always want to do is make sure that we don't think someone's perfect, because they're not.
Yep. And this is where Isaac carries on the traditions of his father. So he is hanging out, and Rebecca's attractive. There seems to be a theme. God's people know how to find some attractive women. Turns out that's a thing. I'm so glad that what they're known by is they were attractive, and they were afraid someone else would come and take them. Again, different customs, different culture. Sexual sin was a really big deal in this society. It was a pretty normal occurrence, and it was a sign of saying, I assert my authority over your people. So it's a pretty big deal. And so he goes, hey, my wife's pretty. I'm going to lie and say she's my sister, which is just a page out of Abraham's book, just like father, like son. And so he lies, and there was a commitment to not deceive one another. And Abimelech goes, seriously? Like, you could have just said it, and we could have moved on. What's interesting is, even though there was a lie in there, Abimelech actually comes out and says, don't touch them. Everybody in the land, don't touch these two. They are protected. We're going to continue to maintain this agreement, even though you deceived me. But that does not stay that for long. They do end up having a disagreement, and I think that's in the in-between, yes. So then Isaac, who continues, verse 12, there you go. Yep. He gets to continue, and this is where we see him and Abimelech kind of turn corners a little bit.
Yep. And Sarah said, so Kelsey, they had the same problem that we have going on today. Yep,
there's something about it that I just hope in the next couple generations. I did want to say, one of the things, the song "The Blessing" has been thrown around a lot in our culture right now. And there's this line or phrase, may his favor be upon you and 1,000 generations, your family and your children and their children and their children. And while that is directly taken out of a passage, this theme is seen throughout. And so we go from Abraham to Isaac, and Isaac, he's saying, listen, I blessed your father, and I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to bless your children and your children. And so we see this in the Old Testament, like God's like, I got you, and I got your next generation and your next generation and your next generation. So there's something, as you sing that song, you now have a bigger picture of like, man, that song has some lyrics that hit God's faithfulness in a brand new way, and we're seeing it lived out in Isaac. We're also seeing Isaac make mistakes like his father. So there you go, generational sin. We're back to square one. It's good.
And I love, so I apologize that I didn't get that text in there. I'm going to add it in just so that for those who come after us, it will be in there. This story of Abimelech and the way that Isaac was deceitful. But when we pick up again in verse 12, Isaac has just been an idiot. And God says here, it says here, the Lord blessed him. In the same year. And Isaac sowed in that land, in the Philistine land, and reaped the same year 100-fold. The Lord blessed him, and the man became rich and gained more and more until he became very wealthy. Now he had possessions of flocks and herds and many servants, so that the Philistines envied him. That's not going to go over well. You've got a sojourner, a visitor in your land who is being blessed beyond measure. He's becoming very wealthy. that doesn't set well with the locals. Kelsey, I'm going to show Crystal's comment here. So what is the piece of the principalizing bridge from these seemingly unrelated stories to an application for me today? I think I'm missing that connection. That is a great question. I mean, I would say, because Isaac feels choppy, right? And we're not getting a good picture of who he is, but I think it's when we look at his whole story where we're seeing, once again, the crazy faithfulness of God. How God promised Abraham, it is fulfilled in Isaac. It carries on through Isaac, even though Isaac doesn't do anything to really deserve God's favor. Because God is faithful, he sees his promises through. That was one of the things that I was really thinking about this morning, was when God is faithful, the promise carries on. Now, does that give me a free pass to sit back and not participate? No, absolutely not. And we see God say that, keep my covenants, keep my statutes, keep my laws, those kinds of things, be faithful. But God is so much bigger than everything else. And so this is one of those stories where I feel like we're seeing God in some of these details, but really what we're seeing is God over all the little details.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would add, from this whole week, Noah through even to now, we see God kind of working his way through, saying, I'm with you, I'm with you, I'm with you, whether you want to be with me or not. I'm with you, I'm with you, I'm with you. And he really is working this long thread ultimately to get us to Jesus. Honestly, this weekend, this is the message this weekend, so you're getting a sneak peek. And as he's weaving this whole thing through, we see God's faithfulness to all people, regardless of what they do and do not do, regardless of how many mistakes. God is good. But there's also this nuance with all of these stories, that there's these side characters. And I know I already kind of went into it at the beginning, but even for Abraham, you see these side characters. For Isaac, you see these side characters. They're not the focal point of the lineage of Jesus. They're not the focal point of what God's up to. And yet God is faithful to them, and he is using them as a part of his faithfulness. And so for me, one of the things that Isaac really shows me is the value and importance of the community around us. That God isn't just fighting for me. He's fighting for me to fight for others, and he's fighting for others to fight for me, which was part of the promise with Abraham. He said, I'm blessing you to be a blessing. The first time he introduces this covenant relationship with Abraham, he says that. He says, I'm blessing you so you can bless others. And we see these other side characters that get to be a part of what we're doing. And that God really, there are no parts that don't have value. Like you could pass by Rebecca and be like, whatever. You could pass by this servant and be like, whatever. The point is Isaac. And yet God is like, no, they're a part of my journey. Look at how interwoven all these different people are and how connected they are. So there's something very powerful about, there's a central focus getting us to Jesus. And yet these characters around us play a part. The people around you play a part in your life too. There's just something there for me. I'm not sure. I'm feeling it today. That's what I'm feeling.
I like that. And I mean, I think it really digs into what I hope so many of us have recognized over the course of the last couple of months is we are not meant to do life alone. We are meant to be in community together. And you look at a story like this and you're like, oh, that feels like a pull. But yet Isaac doesn't survive without the community around him. And none of the patriarchs do. And none of the Israelites do. They depended on one another. And so I love that. Thank you. Okay. Crystal, I hope that was helpful for you. Requests. And then Dom says, God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. He knew their junk and still loved them and was faithful just as he knows our junk and is faithful. Yes.
Well, and even for Isaac, his job, like Abraham, had really big job. His job for Isaac was make a nation, make land. Be faithful even in just creating what God's put in front of you. Because if Isaac didn't do that, the nation wouldn't grow. Just be faithful to what God has in front of you. Sometimes God is asking us to build an ark. Sometimes God is asking us to cultivate the land that's right in front of us. There's something cool about it.
Yep. And then Sarah talks just a little bit about kind of some of her family stuff. Sister committed suicide, and then parents have both passed away. But God is faithful and takes care of his children in spite of what they do. So, yeah. Okay, so we're gonna finish off. We're gonna close up Isaac's story here, but it does have an interesting twist. I wouldn't say twist, but like an interesting end here, and it really shows Isaac's commitment to live well in the land that he's living in. So it feels like he kind of learned a little bit of a lesson with his transgressions with Abimelech, the king here, and so he's moving around and he's digging a well, which would be one of the things that you would need to do so that, and I mean, you think about it, he's got lots of livestock and then he is growing people. And so he is having to dig a well to make sure that there is enough water. And everywhere he goes, he's running into some problems. And so he digs a well and the Philistines come and they fill it up again. And they say, this is ours. And then he digs another, and he just kind of moves on. He's like, oh, I'm sorry. Okay, well, moving on. And he does it again, and he does it again. And finally, they leave him alone, and they let him stay there. But it starts here in verse 23. From there, he went to Beersheba, and the Lord appeared to him the same night and said, I am the God of Abraham, your father. Fear not, for I am with you and will bless you. He said something very similar to Abraham early on. And then it says, I will bless you and multiply your offspring for my servant Abraham's sake. I think that's such an interesting comment that God makes there, because it is that remember, it is that reminder, it is that you are Isaac, you are Abraham's son, and my covenant continues through you because I made this promise through Abraham. And so I love that God just is kind of like, hey, this is who you are, but this is why all of this is happening. And then to Isaac's credit, so he built an altar there and he called upon the name of the Lord and pitched his tent there. And there Isaac's servants dug a well. So
there's actually a lot happening right there that I'm not going to give away a ton. An altar is a theme we've seen a ton. Wherever there's an altar, there's a relationship with God that is being solidified or cultivated. Wherever we see a tent, we understand that someone is experiencing the presence of God, which comes in with Moses. And then Isaac's son is going to dig a well that is going to become a part of the lineage of not just the Jewish people, but actually some people to the point where Jesus ends up having a conversation. So like the well is a sign of God's providence. And so there's, as much as you could just read all three of those, the writer is not messing around. He's like, yep, God's faithfulness, period. Yeah. There's so much good there.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. I'm sorry, everyone. We just don't have enough time. But we are cruising. And you were asking really, really good questions. And so I want to make sure we didn't have application time yesterday, Kelsey. So I want to make sure that we get to application today. So let's see. Crystal here says, how can I intentionally connect the people God has interwoven into my life? That's a great question. So I would love, if you have thoughts on that, I would love to hear your thoughts, but I hope that this is one of those questions that you take and ponder as you're going into that time of reflection, because I think oftentimes we don't do that. And there are times when I see this happen, and it's really neat to watch how God moves through that. So great question. Dom, Isaac did what he did, maybe because he lost lock on God's promise to him. Where have I made poor choices because I've lost lock on God's promise to me and tried to do things by myself? I don't think I've ever lost lock on God's promise for me and tried to do things on my own.
Oh, man.
Such a good question. And I think sometimes I feel like I must be I must be totally clued in on how God's working and what he's doing until I recognize, because I run into something where I'm like, oh, that was me trying to do some things that I wasn't supposed to be doing. I think we see this with Isaac when he's up against Abimelech, thinking there's no way we're going to come out of this in one piece. I'm going to have to do this. We're going to have to say we're brother and sister. We're going to have to figure this out on our own because it doesn't feel like God's got this. And God's like, I've got this. I got this. So what are those things? Where are those places in our lives? It's good. And then Greg says, how do I stay steadfast in my commitment to follow the path that God has designed for me? How do I listen more intently for the direction that God wants me to move in? That's good. And we've talked a lot this week about what that looks like. How do we recognize God's voice? And we keep coming back to the more time that we spend with God, the more time that we are praying, reading the Bible, having these I even think having these kinds of conversations, we learn to recognize God's voice so that we know what's going on there, or at least we have a better indication of it. And then before making a decision on something, stop and take note of all that goes on in it. I tried to do this, but I need to try more. Yeah, that's good. Kelsey, anything you would like to add to that?
It's all good. One of the things that I've been wrestling with all week with these characters, and as I'm getting ready for this weekend, I think back to Dom, this idea of losing step with God, and we kind of think, well, if I just had this really big miracle moment, I would just know, and then for the rest of my life, I'd just have faith in it. And yet we see Isaac, even in his birth, is a miracle, and he can't hold on to it, right? We see Abraham seeing miracle after miracle, and yet he can't hold on to it. We won't get to it this week, but Moses walks people through a Red Sea, gets them to an area, goes and talks to God for 40 days. And when he comes down, everyone has already forgotten that they literally walked through a sea. They escaped imprisonment. They watched these plagues. Like, they forgot all of it in 40 days. And so I think to Dom's point, it is easy for us to go, well, if I just had this aha moment, everything would be okay. If I had this mountaintop experience, if I, could have adult summer camp all over again, I would just stay connected. But to what you're saying, Lisa, it's about an everyday connection. It's about staying plugged in every day. It's about getting in line, to Crystal's thought, with people that help us stay in. Like, there's cultivating life. I know we talked about it a couple weeks ago, but is an intentional choice, because those aha, powerful God moments aren't actually sustainable. Those are launching points for what God's about to do. But then we have to stay committed. So there's just something really good about that. So I just interwove a bunch of those together, but I'm just so it's so easy to be like, well, if I could just have, and yet God's like, no, every day. I want you every day.
Yeah,
it's good.
I heard a guy speak several years ago, and he talked about these moments in the water. These are just these really powerful experiences that we have with God. And he used the example of the Israelites in the Red Sea. He used the example of the Israelites crossing the Jordan River. And then he also goes into Jesus being baptized, and even our own birth, how we're in our mother's womb and there's water in the womb. He said, but on the other side of a water experience, there's always wilderness. Mm-hmm. And so after the Red Sea, the Israelites wander for 40 years in the wilderness. After the Jordan River, the Israelites end up in battle. And so after Jesus is baptized in the water, he ends up in the wilderness being tempted by Satan. And after we are born out of our mother's wombs, we are thrown into the wilderness of this world. And so I've always remembered, and he said, use those water moments and soak it in, but remember that on the other side of the water, there's a wilderness. And so how can you be preparing your heart and your mind that after that experience, that powerful and amazing experience, there's going to be a hard time. And that's just part of life. So that was like that. Greg, thank you for asking. I think we've been real careful this week to just kind of let Phil be with his mom. So I've not been checking in on Phil, and I don't have a good update for you on him, but we are continuing to pray for him and for his mom and for his family. So thank you. All right, any closing thoughts on Isaac?
I think it's good. I'm excited. Well, Jacob's kind of a nincompoop, so I'm excited for tomorrow. But Isaac sets us up with a ton of before we step into another big one, so it'll be good.
I'll say Jacob is a piece of work for sure. So, all right, well, I'm going to pray, and then we'll get on with the rest of our day. God, thank you so much for who you are, and thank you for your faithfulness. Thank you that you don't change, and that you are constantly pursuing us in such a way that even when we run, you run after us. God, I thank you for the stories that have been preserved, that we can read and we can dissect, but God, that we can learn from, and that we can watch you and we can see you. We can see how gracious you are, and how faithful you are and steadfast. God, you remain with these guys even when it feels like the easiest thing would be to walk away. God, thank you for showing us that that's just not who you are. God, we continue to pray for Phil and for his mom. You know what's going on there, and you know exactly what they need. And so, God, we just trust you in this, and we just ask that you would continue to give Phil the strength and the wisdom that he needs, that you would help him to make good choices and right choices that are the best for his family and for his mom. God, that you would encourage Phil right where he is, and just give him rest and rejuvenation, even in a time where I'm sure he could easily feel exhausted and worn out. And God, we pray for Sherry and for Art today, knowing that it's been 3 years since her mom passed away. Just pray that you would be with them today, that you would give them peace and hope, that you would remind them of who you are. And God, I just pray that they would remember the sweet memories today. God, that you would protect their hearts, protect their minds, and God, that today would be a day full of rejoicing and remembering who you are and how you continue to remain so close to them and to their hearts. And God, we lift up Greg's family to you. We pray for his parents, that you would help them to find a church that feels like home, that it would be a safe place for them to go, and a place where they can belong and find good friends, and a place to grow, not only in their relationship with others, but in their relationship with you, and even in their relationship with each other and with their family. And God, we also just praise you that Greg is sleeping better, that he is able to rest at night and wake up in the morning feeling refreshed. That is such a blessing. And God, we don't miss this opportunity to praise you in that. And God, for Sarah, God, we just thank you so much for the trip that they had that was so good for them and good for their family. Thank you for the people that they met along the way. I pray that they were lights to you in every conversation that they had. And God, we just lift up their son to you. We lift up Vernon. And God, we just pray that you would be with him as he is heading to Kansas for this final test that he needs to take. God, that you would just work out all of the details. You know all of the things, and we have already identified that you are so faithful. And so, God, we know that you already have a plan for Vernon and for his family, and we thank you for that. God, we pray that this is hopefully a part of that plan. God, we just love you so much. We thank you for who you are, and we thank you for this opportunity that we have to be together. Pray in Jesus' name. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. This has been fun, and we'll do it again tomorrow.